Archer. Gah! Why, yes, master. Archer froze as his name was called out. Something wrong? Morgan blinked. Nothing, Archer said. What is it anyway? Remember now, today is an important day. Archer nodded. The festival begins today, doesn't it? Exactly. This is why I want to ask for your humble opinion. Morgan eyed the bowman up and down. How? How do I look? She asked quietly, her face forming a blush as the man stared at her. The same as usual, Archer said, unamused. With his arms crossed, he stared at her for a bit and then spoke up. Though if you wish what I think of your entire outfit. I say you're beautiful the way you are. Be beautiful? Morgan stammered at her familiar's bold statement. How can he say such a thing without any restraint? How can he say it so casually? She turned away from the man, holding her face with one hand as she tried to get rid of her embarrassment, hoping that her blushing goes away. Though turn around for a second, she heard the bowman tell her, "There's something I need to adjust." What will that be? She turned to look at the man, only for him to grab her by the face, looking deeply into her eyes. It felt like a volcano erupted throughout her face as she felt the man's touch. There. Much better. Archer adjusted the veil and crown, smiling at her. There? Your crown and veil weren't straight. I adjusted them better. Are you all right, master? Yes. Morgan said depressingly, although embarrassing. Her mind wanted this to go elsewhere. Thank you, Archer. The man nodded at her, smiling as he looked out the window. Today is going to be quite the event. Still, though he is wondering how this event will turn out to be, Morgan exhaled calmly as she began walking. Archer followed her as it was his duty to accompany her. The tournament begins today. Who shall prevail in the long-awaited battle between them? 50-50. Will they finally break the many centuries-old ties? It's time. Morgan stabbed her staff onto the ground, looking down at everyone that awaited in her throne room. My fairy knights, you've all done well over these past few years. Thank you. Your Highness, once again, I ask you to lend me thy strength needed in the tournament. Do you accept? Yes, Your Highness, all the fairy knights said, kneeling in front of Morgan. The main three, the strongest of the strong, Melusine, Baelvansith, and Bajt were at the very front, as the rest of the knights were behind them. Guards, rise. Morgan told the many knights who all rose, then let us go ahead and claim victory. Morgan gripped her staff as it glowed. Her eyes glowed as she looked at Archer, her gaze softened up, and she smiled. I hope you lend me your strength too, Shiro. Archer paused at the soft tone and her gaze, his heart pumping fast as he looked at her. I'll do what I can. Morgan. He referred to her by her real name as well, dropping any formality by calling her by her name. The two looked away, blushing as they realized what they did. The sexual tension is real on this one, Baoban said as she looked blankly at the two. Seriously. Get a room, you two? Agreed. All those in the throne room said, I leave the kingdom to you. Morgan spoke at the black goo that appeared on the floor, morphing and twisting, revealing to be an exact clone of herself. Understood. Morgan nodded. You can do that. Archer looked at the clone who was the same as Morgan. No, Duff, it's a clone, but still, what can't she do? Besides a few things, of course. There are many things I can do. Morgan chuckled. I'll be going now. She looked at her clone. The clone nodded at her. Everyone left the throne room, walking out of the castle as many of Morgan's subordinates cheered at the sight, wishing and worshipping Morgan, yelling at them to utterly humiliate Artoria and her knights. To win the tournament, Morgan smiled at the sight of her people. She takes in pride of the worshipping, her ego boosting with all the praise, and she can't help but feel spoiled by everyone's cheers. With a tap of her staff, herself, Archer, her fairy knights, Habertrot glowed lightly. Then she tapped again, and all of them disappeared. The last thing they heard before teleporting was the cries of her people. Artoria closed her eyes, looking in front of her as she was outside the gates. Her knights are behind her. Morgan had her own eyes closed too. Her knights are also on the opposite side. You seem quite happy, Artoria. What? Are you perhaps hoping to taste the cooking of my familiar? She opened her eyes and grinned, staring down at her sister. Artoria opened her eyes innocently, her smile never leaving. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, because do you hear that, Morgan? Artoria put her hand to her ear as if trying to hear something. No, Morgan raised her brow in confusion. Do you know what she means? She whispered of her familiar. Only for the man to shake his head to the side to show that he doesn't. Ah, truly, such a beautiful sound, Artoria hummed. Listen closely, Morgan. Trust me, she persuaded her sister to raise her hand close to her ear. Morgan sighed and put her hand to her ear, listening to nothing, to be exact, except the sound of silence. W, what is this? You're losing today. Morgan flinched at the loud yell that caused her to grab her ear. She grits her teeth as she saw Artoria smiling with a smug look. You little? Ah. Artoria put her gauntlet finger out, waving it around. I take it Archer is participating in this as well. What of it? Morgan frowned. I do not take kindly to these annoying games of yours, sister. So stop wasting our time and accept the inevitable that shall happen in a few hours. She spat and rolled her eyes. Artoria smiled. Simply put, I don't find it fair. Archer looked confused about this new information. You've summoned a hero of your own to do your bidding. A familiar, simply put. All is fair in the world of war, Morgan said with a smirk. There's no such thing as rules, for I am the rules. Are you sure you're not Gilgamesh? Archer whispered at his master's boasting. Simply put, I have a new participant as well. Artoria smiled. I don't like where this is going, Archer thought. Come on out, Artoria said, and just as Archer stood next to Morgan, a figure materialized next to Artoria, a young adult with long white hair that was tied back at either side with red tassels, a red and black dress that was similar to that of a kimono, while also wearing a long European-style coat. The coat was held by a high collar that was closed by a rope tassel. A woman with a beautiful figure, her skin was tanned and wears long black stockings, her eyes open, and she stared with a serious gaze. Clothing, colour, hair, eyes, skin. She looked similar to Archer. Morgan widened her eyes. I see. Was this Merlin's doing? She frowned at the thought of the incubus. Of course, he gave me the idea, and I thought of it. Artoria smiled. Then she noticed something. She stared at her servant, who looked ahead with wide eyes. Alter ego? She asked. Morgan noticed Archer had wide eyes as well. Archer? Majin-san? Archer asked, surprised. Emiya-senpai. Okita Alter too was shocked. Both counter-guardians looked at each other as they froze. What? Morgan and Artoria both asked. The knights and fairy knights just stared on confused. You two know each other? Yelled both masters to their servants.